Confronting the Shadow Realm. Existential angst. Deconstructionists often struggle with fears of death, meaninglessness, isolation, and freedom, as they understandably cycle through uncomfortable stages of anger, denial, bargaining, and depression. Christians take this predictable turmoil as proof that Christianity is true, though I doubt they use the same logic on the angst of kids who finally reconsider Santa. Uncomfortability is just as frequently correlated with truth as it is with error. I've realized that one of Christianity's biggest jobs is paving over the fundamentally human angst of being aware of our death. Perhaps that's not its primary function, but it seems to be one of the first concerns of the deconstructionists, who often say things like, well then, what really happens when I die? I never really realized how simply patronizing the Christian answer was. Oh, don't worry, that's not a real thing. If you're not here, you're instantaneously with God. Even if that's all Christianity taught, that alone would qualify it as the opium of the masses, allowing us to escape the inconvenient angst of our species, the reckoning with our impending mortality. Dang, how did I miss that? Existential peace. I read about a man who had been convicted of murder, only to be exonerated after serving years on death row. The first judge had concluded with the phrase, "May God have mercy on your soul." Suddenly, that phrase, which had previously seemed so gracious, seemed so arrogant. Who the hell are we, in any situation, to presume we can condemn or release any man from God's mercy, peace, or judgment, regardless of Jesus' assurance in Matthew 18:18 that we have the power to do exactly that? Existential ignorance. Eventually, I started to see that the church leverages a combination of the Bible's infallible wisdom and their human ignorance to coerce believers into irrational or unethical beliefs and actions. They would point to verses where A equals B and where B equals C, but when you demanded the uncomfortable proposition that A equals C, they would respond with a feigned humility, something like, "Oh, we can't know that as mere humans, only God knows that." This allowed them to cast the harshest of judgment without having to take responsibility for it. Once I could recognize the pattern, I saw it everywhere. Clear, divine directives on how to live with complete human immunity from the consequences of those directives. I'll give you 2 of dozens of examples. Example 1. Most Christians would laugh at the idea that we literally pray to a man in the sky who grants our wishes depending on who he's friends with. Yet, as individual concepts, many Christian leaders are unwaveringly certain that the Bible clearly tells us that 1. Jesus is a man. 2. Jesus ascended through the sky up into heaven. 3. He lives in a literal, physical, but glorified body. 4. He sits at the right hand of the Father. 5. Interceding for us. 6. Hearing the individual prayers of believers. And 7. Rejecting those who call unto him, but who have not put their faith in him as the one true God. They love those ideas individually, but they just don't want them stated close enough together that it sounds silly. Example 2. Most churches are certain that the Bible clearly states that 1. Sin disqualifies us from relationship with God. 2. Even one sin. And 3. The wages of sin is death. And 4. Not only physical death, but eternal separation from God. And 5. In a lake of fire. And 6. The only expiation for those sins is through belief in Jesus' resurrection from the dead. And 7. It is not good enough to try to live a moral life because 8. God is no respecter of persons. And 9. Our salvation is not through works, but through faith. But if you ask, so what happened to my 16-year-old boy who was killed in a motorcycle accident last week if he hadn't put his faith in Jesus? They will likely respond with the self-contradictory non-answer, "That's impossible for us to know because God's the only judge. But if you put your faith in Jesus Christ, you can know for sure where you're going to go when you die." He sees dead people. I've been inoculated against the problem of a good God allowing evil since before I knew to have the question. So the thing known as the problem of evil was never that big of a concern for me. Evil was our fault. God was good enough to give us free will, even if that meant we brought evil upon ourselves, a problem for which we needed to apologize to God for making him go through that since he hated to see us in pain. That didn't really seem that weird to me until a recent widespread atrocity. I had been avoiding the news because it was too heartbreaking and I couldn't bear watching it when there was nothing I could do about it. Plus, I tried to tell myself, these atrocities aren't new. They're just new to me. They've been going on since the beginning of time, day in and day out. That's when a Christian 7-year-old restated a theology I recognized as she earnestly lamented the plight of her Lord. She said, "I'd hate to be God right now because he sees everything." I'll admit that it's possible that, as Christianity claims, God is witness to every single rape, torture, murder, and genocide throughout human history, and he just has a better plan than intervening, despite teaching us in many verses throughout the Bible, like Luke 10:25-37, that every good person has a responsibility to intervene, even if the victim is a sworn enemy. It's possible that his perfect form of justice includes punishing a finite amount of evil with an infinite amount of torture, and that it's our definition of good that's so far off that we would be troubled by that. And it's possible that the creator of the universe set up the rules so that all of humanity, men, women, and children, were, by default, headed toward eternal anguish as a punishment for falling short of perfection, and the only way to avoid that suffering was to learn your history. Or at least learn this one particular instance of a crucifixion and take responsibility for it, be grateful for it, and invite the miraculously resurrected victim into your heart, and strive for the rest of your life to hear his inaudible voice and make him your best friend forever. But even then, the deal isn't really sealed until another saved person gets you wet. I mean all of that literally, without the sarcasm or hyperbole of the proselytizing atheist, nor the romantic doublespeak of the evangelical Christians. Maybe this is the actual plan for the universe. Maybe that makes perfect sense, and God just gave me a broken brain that can't process the simple beauty and logic of his plan. If God is omnipotent, there's nothing he has to do, no rules he has to follow, and he doesn't have to explain himself or answer to me. He's allowed to make absolutely no sense to us and still demand we believe in him. He is allowed to give us unending red herrings and remain as hidden as he wants to be. If he wanted to, he could give us zero reason to believe in him and still send us to hell for not believing him if that pleased him. But he gave this one broken-brained human the imperative to be honest. And if I'm really honest, I can't get myself to honestly believe it, or honestly admit that it seems plausible, or honestly state that the evidence leans in that direction in my perhaps broken brain. I wish it still made sense. But honesty and evangelical fundamentalism are just no longer compatible for me. So for now, I'm going to have to roll the dice and hope that if that is all true, God is going to take broken-brained people like me and give us extra credit for at least being honest, even when it's devastatingly difficult. Fetus Abortion, Part 1. Putting aside my personal views on abortion for the moment, I was taught that abortion is always wrong. Every human life is sacred, even in the cases of messing up and accidental pregnancy, and the extremists of us kept the same stance for rape and incest. We said, that's a human life, and no innocent baby deserves to be robbed of life just because their parents sinned. Perhaps you see what's coming. The Bible. God committed abortions and infanticide for parents' sins all the time. Of course, he slaughtered innumerable babies, born and unborn, in the flood for the sins of their parents. He did the same in Sodom and also their sister city, Gomorrah, once again for the sins of their parents. Then there were approximately 10 times that God inspired the biblical authors to write and preserve for our benefit the fact that God specifically instructed the Israelites to kill women, pregnant or not, and their children, because their parents didn't worship the right God, a God they had never known. From the Old Testament to the New, and everywhere in between, generational curses, including death, are a common theme, including King Ahab and the exile of Judah. And let's not forget that when David and Bathsheba lied, committed adultery, and murdered Bathsheba's husband so they could be together, God punished them by murdering their firstborn, which is a theme also found in the 10th plague of Egypt, where God killed every single firstborn in the entire nation. Exodus 12:30 says, "So there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead." Apparently God knows as well as the mob, if you really want to get to someone, leave them alone and screw with their kids. It worked. David repented, and Pharaoh let the Israelites go. Fortunately for God's reputation, the plagues probably never happened. Of course, in a broader and literal sense, Christianity claims that every single abortion and infant murder is a result of the fall, a generational curse for being born in the lineage of Adam and Eve. Dang, how did I miss that? That doesn't mean that God approves of Roe v. Wade. But if I'm really honest, God doesn't seem to have any problem aborting a baby when its parents have messed up. This was disgustingly reinforced by many churches I know that claimed that specific miscarriages were punishment for the sin of the parent's life. And when the parents were, quote, unfit, according to church standards, it was often called a gracious act of God by the same people who protested clinics where humans carried out that same gracious act without the church's approval. To be fair, God did specifically forbid humanity from holding generational grudges in Deuteronomy 24:16. Do as I say, not as I do, I guess. But the verse immediately before that also says it's a sin to pay your employees bi-weekly. So, again, it's hard to know which parts and why of Deuteronomy are supposed to be thrown out and which are supposed to be considered timeless wisdom. Note: upon rereading the story of David and Bathsheba, it doesn't seem like they sinned together. Bathsheba did not seduce David, nor concede to, nor know of, David's murder of her husband, nor is there any indication that she consented to sex with David, nor the subsequent marriage. According to 2 Samuel 11:26, Bathsheba seemed to be a contently married woman impregnated by a man she was not in a position to deny. I don't know what that was called back then, but I know what it's called today. They did not commit adultery. David committed rape. I understand. Times were different back then, as God's chosen people were merely following his supernaturally handwritten eternal commandments of superior morality. Perhaps it would be unfair to compare their supernaturally revealed morality to the basic common decency of modern secular humanism. God had not yet made it self-evident that all men are created equal or endowed them with unalienable rights. On the contrary, God frequently commanded horrendous oppression back then, so I'm not saying Bathsheba would have perceived her experience as sexual abuse any more than the God-ordained slaves of the day would have had the vocabulary to complain about the inequity of opportunity. But even in the warped morality God commanded the Israelites to live by, I can't see any fault in Bathsheba's choices. God is the one who put Bathsheba's soul in that body. Her sin was existing, and her punishment was the loss of David's baby. This does not mean that God is always in favor of abortion in the case of rape, but he was this time. Fetus abortion, part 2. This time, not putting aside my personal views on abortion, I'm against abortion. But honestly, I don't know anyone who is pro-abortion any more than I know anyone who is pro-chemotherapy. If the topic is relevant, it's a bummer. Unfortunately, people are careless about intercourse and tanning beds, and other people are just unlucky, making such difficult topics sadly relevant. Furthermore, I can't find a single heartless atheist who thinks that an amoeba is instantly turned into a human as it crosses the labial finish line. Instead, I find that most people consider the cessation of fetal life to be more egregious the more developed it is. Among those people is God, according to Jewish and Christian tradition. Exodus 21:22-23 explains, if people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there's no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life. That text immediately moves away from the topic to legislate slave ownership, so Jewish rabbis and later Christians were forced to interpret this short law for the edge cases. Most all of them agreed, if this happens early in the pregnancy when the baby isn't really formed yet, the offender should probably get off with a lighter punishment than death. God did say, take life for life, but the consensus was that you shouldn't take a man's life for causing the discharge of an embryo. As far as I can find, there's no such exception in the case of collateral death of a human who has been born. Fetuses are different, according to God. Oof. As dark as that topic is, that actually makes a lot of sense. Fetus abortion, part 3. Don't worry, we're almost done with this topic. Jeremiah 1:5 is a beautiful sentiment from the Father, and apparently an anti-abortionist's favorite verse. It says, before I formed you in the womb, I chose you. Somehow, I never noticed that the verse has nothing to do with God's relationship to an embryo. It says, before I formed you, which is about God's relationship to a soul before conception, before they were in any way formed. It's still a beautiful verse, but it doesn't seem that God intends to come out as anti-abortion here, unless he's also coming out as anti-masturbation, since that is the mass murder of millions of potential souls that God knew personally before they were formed. Which he might be, and I don't mean that sarcastically. That certainly wasn't a hyperbolic interpretation to the hundreds or thousands of popes, cardinals, priests, and pastors, far too many to mention, throughout Christendom, who have used scriptures to prohibit any erogenous acts that deviate from, quote, God's procreative purpose of sex. And that position actually aligns better with the writings of the biblical authors, who had a non-modern understanding of biology, as evidenced by verses like Hebrews 7:9-10, which says, when Melchizedek met Abraham, Levi was still in the body of his ancestor. Levi was Abraham's great-grandson. But this view matches perfectly with a God who would have claimed he knew Levi even before he was formed in his mother's womb. Whatever person or persons wrote the verses that say every single abortion makes God angry also wrote that ejaculation is murder and descendants are stored inside their ancestors. If the author was just a bunch of leaders from a religion thousands of years ago, yeah, that would make way more sense. I'm still against abortion, but the Bible is almost no help in that crusade. Adult abortion. This is the last one. Many Christians I knew resolve the abortion paradox by taking the position that it's okay when God does it, but it's not our place to take a human life. Fair enough. But somehow those were frequently the same Christians fighting to uphold the death penalty. Dang, how did I miss that? They claimed the death penalty was justified, even necessary, after an adult had committed a crime that they had judged was worthy of the death penalty. But in the Christian God's eyes, original sin-stained babies are, for all practical purposes, just as deserving of death and eternal torment as any mass-murdering child rapist. Note, I understand that sentence is extremely unpleasant. Please let me know if I have overstated the fundamentalist position in any way, other than putting it more bluntly than we usually prefer. The pro-death penalty Christians who fire up the electric chair on behalf of their God of justice also claim that 1. God is the only judge, 2. All sins can be forgiven, and 3. No one is irredeemable. This complicates the issue, giving the mass-murdering child rapist a better shot at heaven since they have the time between incarceration and electrocution to ask for the forgiveness of their sins, whereas the babies are given no such opportunity. The Christian responses I've heard are some exasperated version of, well, first, these are unknowable situations, which you wouldn't even bring up unless you were trying to find a reason to justify your sin. And also, we know God's judgments are perfect, and these rare situations are just a mystery of God. The first part is simply a logical fallacy known as an ad hominem attack, an attack on an opponent's character in place of addressing the actual issue. An equally unfair and irrelevant response, which I wouldn't make, would sound something like, you only refuse to engage with such topics because they threaten your beloved institution of murdering people you don't like and protecting the pedophiles you do like. Unfortunately, the middle part isn't an argument either, but a reassertion of the belief, on par with the equally indefensible pseudo-argument, we know God's judgments aren't perfect. And lastly, these situations are anything but rare, and this reality is only a mystery of God when a mysterious God is imposed on reality. Outside of the Christian worldview, abortion and the death penalty are not knotted up together in a conundrum, and most of us agree, hey everybody, let's try not to get too killy except where we absolutely must. Unfortunately, the invisible deities are usually the ones opposing that view, telling us that we absolutely must destroy whoever happens to be our current enemy.